Thomas Blackwood had lived alone on his remote Arizona Territory ranch for 7 years, and he preferred it that way. At 42, the former Union soldier's face was weathered from sun and solitude, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats, Apache raiders, desperate outlaws, or government men with questions he didn't care to answer. April 1877 had brought unseasonable heat to the high desert. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow as he repaired fence lines damaged during winter storms. His 100-acre spread nestled in a valley flanked by red rock formations that glowed like embers at sunset. Most called this land unforgiving, but Thomas had made peace with its harshness. The gunshots came just after noon, 3 sharp cracks echoing from the eastern ridge. Thomas froze, hand instinctively moving to the Remington revolver on his hip. Cavalry, most likely. They'd been increasing patrols since the Chiricahua Apache had fled the San Carlos Reservation 3 months prior. Thomas returned to his work, determined to mind his own business. But as he drove the last fence post into the dusty ground, movement caught his eye. A small figure stumbling down the slope toward his property. "Damn it all," he muttered, dropping his tools. Trouble always found those who didn't seek it. Through his field glasses he saw it was a child, a girl, Apache by her dress, no more than 10 years old. Blood stained her left arm, and her movements betrayed exhaustion, near collapse. Thomas hesitated only briefly. Whatever had happened on that ridge, he wanted no part of it. But he couldn't leave a wounded child to die, no matter her people. He reached her just as her legs gave out. Up close, he saw the wound was a bullet graze, painful, but not immediately life-threatening. Her eyes, wide with terror, darted past him toward the ridge where dust clouds signaled approaching riders. "Cavalry," Thomas said, more to himself than the girl. She wouldn't understand English anyway. The decision came swiftly. Thomas scooped her up, surprised at how little she weighed, and carried her toward the ranch house. If the patrol found her, they'd take her to the reservation. Or worse, if these were the type of soldiers who didn't bother with formalities when it came to Apache hostiles. The girl struggled weakly in his arms until he whispered, "Shika Nolta. I'm helping you." One of the few Apache phrases he'd picked up during his years on the frontier. His homestead was simple but solid, a main house built of adobe and timber, a barn, and a stone cellar dug into the hillside where he stored supplies for the harsh winters. It was to this cellar he headed now, unlocking the heavy wooden door and carrying the girl inside. The space was cool and dark, lined with shelves of preserved foods and supplies. Thomas laid the girl on a pallet of burlap sacks and pressed a finger to his lips. "Stay quiet," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand, but hoping his tone conveyed the message. He quickly tended her wound with water and cloth, then left her with a canteen and some dried meat. "I'll be back." Outside, he scattered dirt to cover their tracks, then strode toward the approaching patrol, his mind racing. 4 riders crested the hill, led by a lieutenant whose immaculate uniform suggested he was new to the territory. "Afternoon, soldiers," Thomas called, hand casually resting on his fence post, far from his revolver. "What brings the U.S. cavalry to my humble ranch?" The lieutenant reined his horse, dust swirling around the patrol. "We're tracking Apache hostiles. A band attacked a supply wagon this morning. We wounded one, a child." His eyes narrowed. "Seen anything unusual today, Mr. Blackwood?" Thomas Blackwood. He met the officer's gaze steadily. "And no, Lieutenant. Just been mending fences since dawn. Haven't seen a soul." The first lie was always the easiest. The ones to follow would determine whether 2 lives would be forfeit before sunset. "Mind if we water our horses, Blackwood?" The lieutenant's question wasn't really a question. "Help yourselves." Thomas gestured toward the well. "Been mighty dry this season." As the soldiers dismounted, Thomas observed them with practiced caution. Besides the lieutenant, Simmons by the name stitched on his uniform, there were 3 enlisted men. 2 looked seasoned, with hard eyes that had seen Apache combat. The 3rd was young, probably on his first frontier assignment. "Your ranch is quite isolated," Simmons remarked, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "No trouble with the locals?" Thomas shrugged. "Keep to myself. They do the same." "Admirable arrangement." Simmons's tone suggested he found it suspicious rather than admirable. "Mind if we look around? Protocol, you understand." The request sent ice through Thomas's veins, but his face betrayed nothing. "My home is my own, Lieutenant, unless you have orders stating otherwise." Simmons's jaw tightened. The girl we're tracking is wounded. Harboring enemies of the United States is treason, Blackwood. "I fought at Antietam and Gettysburg, Lieutenant. Don't lecture me about loyalty." Thomas let that sink in. "But by all means, look in the barn if you must. Then I'd appreciate you moving on. Daylight's burning, and I've work to finish." The calculated mention of his Union service shifted something in Simmons' demeanor. He nodded to one of the older soldiers, who proceeded to inspect the barn, while the others watered their horses. Thomas fought to keep his breathing steady. The cellar entrance was hidden behind the house, out of direct sight. If they did a thorough search of the property, though, they'd find it easily enough. "Barn's clear, sir," the soldier reported upon his return. Simmons studied Thomas for a long moment. The Apache were tracking murdered 2 good men this morning. A civilian driver and Private Ellis cut their throats while they slept. Thomas met his gaze. "That's a hard thing, Lieutenant, but I haven't seen any Apache today." Another lie. Smooth as the first. Thomas had known men who'd developed a taste for it during the war, fabricating entire lives when they returned home. He'd never had the knack for it until now, with a child's life hanging on his words. "We'll continue our patrol," Simmons finally said. "If you see anything, there's an army post 20 miles east at Vengeance Creek. Ask for Captain Warner." "I'll do that," Thomas agreed, knowing he never would. As the patrol mounted up, the young soldier hesitated. "Sir, what about the blood trail? It seemed to lead this way." Thomas's heart stuttered, but Simmons waved dismissively. "Probably a wounded coyote, Jensen. The trail went cold at the creek bed." The soldiers rode off, dust billowing behind them. Thomas waited until they disappeared over the ridge before releasing a long breath. He'd bought time, nothing more. If they returned with a larger patrol to search properly, the girl would be found. Thomas hurried to the cellar. Inside, the girl had wedged herself into a corner behind some barrels, clutching a rusty hay knife she must have found on a shelf. Her eyes glittered with fear and determination in the dim light. "It's all right," he said softly, keeping his distance. "They're gone. For now." She didn't lower the knife. Thomas mimed drinking, then offered her the canteen again. After a moment's hesitation, she took it with her free hand, the knife still pointed at him. Smart girl. As she drank, Thomas assessed her more carefully. Her wound needed proper cleaning and bandaging. She was thin, not just from days on the run, but the chronic hunger of reservation life. Her clothes were a mixture of traditional Apache and scraps of Army-issued cloth, common among those forced onto reservations. "My name Thomas," he said, tapping his chest. Then he pointed to her, raising his eyebrows in question. She stared silently, still gripping the knife. "Fair enough," he murmured. "You don't trust me. Probably shouldn't." He retrieved a proper medical kit from a shelf and set it on the ground between them, opening it to show bandages and ointments. He pantomimed treating her arm. After long consideration, she lowered the knife slightly and extended her wounded arm. Progress. As Thomas cleaned the wound with carbolic solution, the girl hissed in pain but remained stoically still. The bullet had carved a furrow along her upper arm, painful but clean enough to heal if infection didn't set in. "You're lucky," he told her, as he wrapped a bandage around her arm. "But we both know they'll be back, and next time they won't take my word." The cellar would become either sanctuary or tomb. Thomas just didn't know which yet. Night fell across the ranch, bringing no relief from the day's tension. Thomas had moved the girl from the cellar to a small storage room adjacent to the kitchen, reasoning that keeping her in the main house would be safer if soldiers returned unexpectedly. He'd given her a blanket, food, and water, then secured the door, not to imprison her, but to prevent her from fleeing into dangers she couldn't anticipate. As he sat by the fireplace, cleaning his revolver, Thomas confronted the magnitude of his decision. Harboring an Apache child, likely one connected to the band that had killed those men, put everything he'd built at risk. The military would show no leniency if they discovered her. At best, he'd lose his ranch. At worst, he'd face imprisonment or hanging for treason. "You've stepped in it now, Tom," he muttered to himself, the familiar ritual of gun cleaning bringing no comfort tonight. A soft sound from the storage room interrupted his thoughts. Thomas approached cautiously and opened the door to find the girl attempting to pry boards from the small window with a spoon she'd somehow concealed. "Persistent, aren't you?" he said, not unkindly. She dropped the spoon and backed away, her expression defiant despite her fear. In the better light, Thomas could see she was older than he'd first thought, perhaps 12 or 13, not 10. He held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "You can't leave yet. Not safe." He pointed outside and made a slashing motion across his throat, hoping she'd understand. The girl's eyes darted to the window, then back to Thomas. Slowly, she spoke, her first words since he'd found her. "Nda," she said, then switched to halting English. "They come back. Kill you." Thomas blinked in surprise. "You speak English?" She nodded slightly. "Little. San Carlos School?" "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Nijoni." "Nijoni," he repeated carefully. "I'm Thomas." "Why help?" she asked, the simple question loaded with complexity. Thomas considered this. "Because it was right," he finally said, though the answer felt inadequate, even to him. A distant whinny from outside froze them both. Thomas quickly closed the storage room door and moved to the front window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Moonlight revealed a lone rider approaching, not in uniform, but moving with military precision. "Stay quiet," he whispered, through the door to Nijoni, then grabbed his revolver and positioned himself beside the front entrance. The knock, when it came, was soft but insistent. "Blackwood," a voice called. "It's Sergeant Hayes from the patrol. I'm alone. Need to talk." Thomas recognized the voice as belonging to one of the older soldiers from earlier. He kept his revolver ready as he cracked the door. Hayes stood on the porch, hands visible. "May I come in?" Thomas hesitated, then stepped back, allowing the soldier entry, but keeping his weapon trained on him. "Figured you might be cautious," Hayes said, eyeing the revolver without concern. "I would be too." "What do you want, Sergeant?" Hayes removed his hat. To warn you, Lieutenant's not satisfied with your story. He's convinced you're hiding something, and he's arranging a proper search party for tomorrow. Thomas's grip tightened on his revolver. Why tell me this? Because I know what happened this morning. Hayes's voice hardened. That supply wagon was carrying whiskey to sell to the Apache against regulations. When they refused to pay Lieutenant Simmons's cut, he ordered Private Ellis to shoot one of them. Things went bad from there. Thomas studied the man, looking for deception. You expect me to believe an Army sergeant is betraying his officer? I expect you to recognize I'm Chiricahua on my mother's side, Hayes said evenly. Mixed blood enough to pass, especially when I don't mention it. The girl you're hiding, she's my niece's age. The revelation stunned Thomas into momentary silence. Where is she? Hayes asked. How do I know this isn't a trick? You don't, Hayes shrugged. But Simmons will be here by noon tomorrow with 6 men. If she's still here, you'll both suffer. Thomas made his decision. She's wounded, but mobile. Speaks some English. Good. There's an Apache camp 3 ridges north. I can get her there tonight. Why should she trust you? Why should I? Hayes's expression darkened. Because Simmons doesn't take prisoners, especially child ones, and he's already planning what to do with you for interfering. This isn't a war with rules anymore, Blackwood. It's extermination. The brutal truth hung in the air between them, a reckoning Thomas had avoided confronting until now. Thomas led Hayes to the storage room and unlocked the door. Inside, Nijoni had armed herself with a wooden ladle, prepared to fight despite the futility. When she saw Hayes, her eyes widened with recognition and fear. "Da!" she hissed, backing against the wall. "It's all right," Thomas said, though he kept his revolver trained on Hayes. "He says he's here to help." Hayes spoke to her in Apache, his words flowing with natural cadence. Nijoni responded hesitantly at first, then with increasing animation. Thomas watched their exchange, understanding nothing, but recognizing the girl's gradual shift from suspicion to cautious hope. Finally, Hayes turned to Thomas. She says her family was camped peacefully when soldiers came demanding tribute. When they had nothing to give, the shooting started. She ran, but was hit. The rest of her family... He left the sentence unfinished. Thomas holstered his revolver. "Can you really get her to safety?" "There's a band camped in the high country led by her mother's cousin. If we leave now, we can reach them before dawn." "And tomorrow, when Simmons comes looking?" Hayes's expression hardened. "You have choices, Blackwood. Be gone when they arrive, or stay and face what comes." "Running makes me look guilty." "You are guilty of basic human decency." Hayes checked his timepiece. "We need to move. Nijoni, di nashgon. Let's go." The girl gathered the blanket around her shoulders, but hesitated, looking at Thomas. "You come?" she asked in English. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. "Number I'll stay?" Hayes frowned. "That's suicide." "This is my home. I won't be driven from it." Thomas moved to a cabinet and retrieved a small sack of cornmeal and dried meat. "Take this for the journey." While Hayes and Nijoni prepared to leave, Thomas withdrew to his bedroom and unlocked a trunk he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay his Union Army uniform, folded with precision, and a document bearing President Lincoln's signature, a commendation for valor at Gettysburg. Beneath these rested a daguerreotype of a woman whose smile still haunted him. "Rebecca," he whispered, touching the image gently, "what would you have me do?" His wife had died of fever during the war, never seeing the peace that followed. Thomas had come west afterward, seeking distance from memories too painful to carry. He'd built this ranch from nothing, a tribute to her belief in him. Now he faced losing it all, or compromising the principles that had made her love him. When he returned, Hayes was checking Nijoni's wound one last time. "You should tend that daily," Thomas told him, handing over the medical supplies. "Keep it clean." Hayes nodded. "What will you tell Simmons?" "The truth. That I never saw any Apache. The technical accuracy of this lie, he'd seen a child, not warriors, felt like small comfort." Nijoni approached Thomas, her expression solemn. From her pocket, she withdrew a small object and pressed it into his hand, a polished stone pendant on a leather cord. "Protection," she said simply. Thomas was speechless at the gesture. He'd given this child refuge for mere hours, yet she offered him a talisman of her people. "Go now," he said roughly, emotion threatening to break through, "and travel safe." From his window, Thomas watched Hayes lead Nijoni away on his horse, the pair soon swallowed by darkness. The emptiness that followed felt both familiar and newly painful, a return to solitude, but now with purpose. Thomas spent the night preparing. He cleaned his revolver again and loaded his Winchester repeating rifle. He burned any evidence of Nijoni's presence, the bloodied bandages, the blanket she'd used, and scrubbed the storage room floor. By dawn, no trace remained of the girl who had briefly disrupted his isolation. As sunlight crept across the valley, Thomas sat on his porch with coffee, watching the eastern ridge where he knew soldiers would soon appear. His decision had crystallized during the night. He would not flee, nor would he confess. He would stand his ground against Simmons and his accusations, armed with nothing but his own word and the knowledge that he had done right by his conscience. Thomas touched the stone pendant hanging from his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. The weight of it reminded him that integrity sometimes demanded a terrible price, one he was now prepared to pay. They arrived just before noon, 7 riders silhouetted against the cloudless sky. Thomas counted them from his porch. Lieutenant Simmons, the young soldier Jensen, 4 other troopers, and a civilian tracker, whose Apache heritage showed in his features, but whose allegiance was bought with Army gold. Thomas set aside his whittling and stood as they approached, hands visible and empty. The Winchester rested just inside the doorway, close enough to reach, but not overtly threatening. "Lieutenant," he called as they reined in, "expected you might return." Simmons dismounted, dust billowing around his polished boots. "Where's Sergeant Hayes, Blackwood? He rode out to scout your property last night and never returned." So Hayes hadn't reported back. Interesting. Haven't seen any sergeant since your visit yesterday. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "Search the property," he ordered his men. "Every building, every corner." The soldiers dismounted and spread out. The trackers circled the house, eyes scanning the ground for signs. "This is still private property, Lieutenant," Thomas said evenly. "This is a military operation, Blackwood. Your cooperation would be advisable." Simmons's hand rested casually on his holstered pistol. "Where were you between sundown and sunrise?" "Right here, sleeping in my bed." "Alone, I presume?" Thomas met his gaze, "As I have been for 7 years." The young soldier, Jensen, emerged from the barn. "Clear, sir." 2 others reported the same from the corral and outbuildings. The tracker knelt by the side of the house, examining disturbed earth where Thomas had scattered chicken feed at dawn to obliterate any tracks. "Someone rode out from here," the tracker said, rising. 2 people on 1 horse, heading north. Simmons turned to Thomas, his expression hardening. Care to revise your statement, Blackwood? I've nothing to add, Lieutenant. The officer stepped closer. The Apache child we were tracking was part of a band that murdered American soldiers. Aiding her escape makes you complicit in those deaths. I haven't aided anyone, Thomas replied, the technical truth bitter on his tongue. Sir, called another soldier from the cellar, found this. He held up a scrap of bloodied cloth Thomas had overlooked in his cleanup, a damning piece of evidence. Simmons smiled without warmth. I'm placing you under military arrest, Blackwood. Step away from the house. Thomas remained still. On what charge? Treason, aiding enemies of the United States. That child was no enemy, and you know it. The words escaped before Thomas could stop them. An implicit admission. Triumph flashed in Simmons's eyes. So you did harbor her. Where is she now? Where is Hayes? Thomas realized his mistake too late. He glanced at the Winchester just inside the door, calculating his odds. Poor against 6 armed men, but perhaps that had been his subconscious plan all along. A final stand rather than capture, and the hangman's noose. I asked you a question, traitor, Simmons growled, drawing his pistol. The confrontation froze as hoofbeats approached from the east. All eyes turned to see a rider in captain's uniform, followed by 3 soldiers. Lieutenant Simmons, the newcomer called sharply. Stand down, immediately. Confusion crossed Simmons's face. Captain Warner? Sir, this civilian has admitted to harboring Apache hostiles. I said stand down. Warner dismounted, his weathered face set in rigid lines. Private Jensen, report to me directly. What have you witnessed here today? The young soldier stepped forward nervously. Sir, we came to question Mr. Blackwood about a wounded Apache and missing Sergeant Hayes. We found bloodied cloth in the cellar, and the tracker identified signs that 2 people left on horseback. Warner nodded. Did Mr. Blackwood threaten or impede your investigation? No, sir. Lieutenant Simmons, holster your weapon, Warner ordered. Then join me inside Mr. Blackwood's home. The rest of you remain outside. Simmons reluctantly obeyed, shooting Thomas a venomous glance as he followed Warner into the house. Thomas entered last, positioning himself near the Winchester, but making no move to touch it. Once inside, Warner turned to face them both. Sergeant Hayes reported to Fort McDowell this morning with disturbing allegations about yesterday's incident. He claims you ordered the execution of unarmed Apache, then pursued a wounded child with intent to eliminate witnesses. Simmons paled. The sergeant is lying, sir. The Apache attacked our patrol. Hayes brought 2 witnesses, civilians who were hunting nearby and observed the entire encounter. Warner's voice cut like steel. They've signed affidavits. Thomas watched the lieutenant's composure crack as the implications became clear. Hayes had secured not only Nijoni's safety, but evidence against Simmons. Mr. Blackwood, Warner continued, did you shelter a wounded Apache child on your property? Thomas straightened. I neither confirm nor deny that, Captain. This is my home, and what happens here is my business. Warner studied him, then nodded slightly. A man's home is indeed his castle, even in the Arizona Territory. For Thomas, the words carried a weight beyond their surface meaning, an acknowledgment of boundaries the Army would not cross, at least under Warner's command. The confrontation had ended before it truly began, but Thomas knew the reprieve might be temporary. Some battles left no victors, only survivors. Captain Warner departed with Simmons in custody, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and the lingering tension of near disaster. The lieutenant would face a military tribunal for his actions, though Thomas harbored few illusions about justice in such matters. Officers accused of crimes against Indians rarely faced severe consequences. The following days passed in hyper-vigilant solitude. Thomas repaired the damage left by the soldiers' search, scrubbed the cellar until no trace of blood remained, and resumed his routine with mechanical precision. Yet something had fundamentally changed. His isolation, once a comfort, now felt hollow. At night, he found himself touching the stone pendant Nijoni had given him, wondering if she had reached her people safely. Had her wound healed cleanly? Would she remember the brief sanctuary of a stranger's home? Or would the trauma of soldiers and bloodshed overshadow all else? A week after the confrontation, Thomas spotted dust on the horizon, a single rider approaching from the north. He retrieved his Winchester and waited on the porch, ready for whatever might come. The rider resolved into Sergeant Hayes, now dressed in civilian clothing. He dismounted at a respectful distance and raised his hands to show he was unarmed. "Blackwood," he called. "Permission to approach?" Thomas lowered his rifle slightly. "Granted." Hayes walked forward, leading his horse. "Thought you deserved to know how things stand." "The girl?" "Safe with her mother's people. The wound is healing well." Hayes glanced at the pendant, visible at Thomas's neck. "I see she gave you her protection stone." Thomas's hand moved unconsciously to touch it. "What brings you here, Hayes?" "Surely not just to deliver news you could have kept to yourself?" "Warner ordered me to check on you." Hayes tied his horse to the hitching post. "And to deliver this." He extracted an envelope from his saddlebag and handed it to Thomas. Inside was a formal letter acknowledging that Thomas Blackwood had been cleared of all suspicion regarding activities contrary to military operations. It was signed by Captain Warner and stamped with an official seal. "This doesn't make sense," Thomas said, frowning. "Why would Warner protect me?" Hayes's expression remained neutral. "Captain Warner lost his wife and daughter to smallpox at Fort Apache 3 years ago. A Chiricahua medicine woman tried to save them. She couldn't, but he never forgot the attempt." He paused. "Some men carry their ghosts differently than others." Thomas understood ghosts all too well. And Simmons? "Transferred to a desk position at Fort Yuma. No tribunal." Hayes's jaw tightened, as I expected. "And you? Won't they question your loyalty now?" "I've resigned my commission." Hayes gazed across the ranch. 15 years in the Army taught me the difference between duty and blindly following orders. I'm heading to California." Thomas studied the man who had risked everything for principle. "That's a long journey to make alone." "I won't be alone. There are others, mixed bloods, sympathizers, helping families escape the reservations." Hayes hesitated. "We could use a way station, somewhere between here and the Colorado River." The implication hung in the air. Thomas had already risked everything for one child. Hayes was asking him to make that risk permanent, to turn his isolated ranch into a waypoint for those fleeing persecution. "That's a hanging offense," Thomas said quietly. "So was helping Nijoni." Hayes shrugged. "Yet here you stand." Thomas walked to the edge of his porch, looking out across the land he'd cultivated from wilderness. He'd come west, seeking isolation from humanity's cruelties, only to find them flourishing in new forms. His neutrality had always been an illusion. There were no sidelines in a war for survival. Rebecca would have opened our door without hesitation, he said, more to himself than Hayes. The memory of his wife's compassion remained his truest compass. Who? Hayes asked. Someone who knew right from wrong better than I ever did. Thomas turned back to face him. I'll need to expand this cellar, make it accessible from inside the house. Hayes nodded, understanding the decision. I'll be back in 3 weeks with the first group. Small, just a woman and 2 children. I'll be ready. Thomas extended his hand, and Hayes grasped it firmly. After Hayes departed, Thomas stood, watching the horizon long after the dust had settled. He touched the pendant again, drawing strength from its smooth surface and what it represented, not just protection, but connection to something larger than his solitary existence. That night, for the first time in years, Thomas opened the trunk containing his most precious possessions and placed Rebecca's daguerreotype on the mantel where he could see it daily. Her smile would witness what came next, his final, irrevocable step away from neutrality into dangerous purpose. 2 months transformed Thomas Blackwood's ranch, the expanded cellar now connected to the house through a trapdoor concealed beneath the kitchen table. He'd installed ventilation shafts disguised as abandoned ground squirrel burrows and stocked emergency provisions sufficient to sustain multiple people for weeks, if necessary. 4 groups had already passed through, 17 souls total, mostly women and children, though occasionally a wounded warrior needing medical attention before continuing westward. Thomas learned rudimentary Apache phrases, sharing meals with his temporary guests when safe, listening to stories that reminded him how narrow his world had become in his years of self-imposed exile. August brought merciless heat that shimmered above the valley floor like a living thing. Thomas worked before dawn and after dusk, spending the brutal midday hours inside. He was repairing a chair on his porch as the sun began its descent when movement on the northern ridge caught his eye. 3 riders, moving with purpose, not military. Their approach lacked the rigid formation of cavalry. Thomas reached for his field glasses, then froze as recognition dawned. The lead rider was Hayes, as expected. Behind him rode an Apache woman whose proud posture spoke of dignity preserved despite hardship. The third, smaller figure, riding double with the woman, was unmistakable, even at a distance. Nijoni had returned. Thomas set aside his tools and walked out to meet them, emotion tightening his throat.
As they drew closer, he saw changes in the girl. She sat straighter. Her face had filled out, and the haunted look in her eyes had softened. The wound on her arm had healed, leaving only a pale scar visible below her sleeve. Hayes dismounted first. Blackwood, hope we're still welcome. Always, Thomas replied, his eyes on Nijoni. Didn't expect to see her again. The woman dismounted gracefully, then helped Nijoni down. Up close, the family resemblance was evident, the same determined set of the jaw, the same watchful intelligence in their eyes. This is Auchini, Nijoni's mother, Hayes explained. She insisted on meeting the man who saved her daughter. Thomas hadn't expected this. She speaks English? Better than you speak Apache, the woman replied with a hint of amusement. I was interpreter at San Carlos before we fled. Nijoni approached Thomas, studying him intently before speaking. You still have it? Thomas touched the stone pendant at his neck. Never take it off. It belonged to my father, she said softly. He died the day soldiers came. The simple statement struck Thomas with unexpected force. He knelt to meet her eyes. I'm honored to wear it, thank you. Auchini watched this exchange with unreadable expression. My daughter says you risked everything for a stranger. This is not common among white men. Not common among any men, Thomas replied, but sometimes necessary. He invited them inside, aware of the risk, but unwilling to conduct this reunion in the open. As Hayes secured the horses in the barn, Thomas prepared coffee for the adults and found a jar of preserved peaches for Nijoni. Seated at his table, recently expanded to accommodate guests, Thomas felt the strangeness of hearing conversation in his once silent home. Auchini spoke of their journey north to temporary sanctuary with her cousin's band, of the constant movement required to evade army patrols, of their planned passage to the Colorado River and beyond. "Hayes says you help others now," she said, her direct gaze challenging Thomas to deny or confirm. "I try," he acknowledged. "It's little enough." "It is everything to those who pass through," Hayes interjected as he joined them. "But we can't stay long. Patrol patterns have changed. They're watching the northern routes more carefully." Thomas nodded. "You can rest here tonight. Leave before dawn." As evening fell, Nijoni helped Thomas prepare a simple meal, moving around his kitchen with the adaptive ease of childhood. She asked questions about his tools, his books, the photograph of Rebecca, curiosity undiminished by her hardships. Thomas answered each inquiry patiently, finding unexpected comfort in her presence. After dinner, as Hayes and Auchini conferred quietly about their route, Nijoni approached Thomas on the porch, where he sat watching the stars emerge. "My mother says we go to a place called California," she said. "Is it far?" "Very far," Thomas replied, "but Hayes knows the way." She considered this. "Will you come too?" The question caught him off guard. "Number my place is here." "Alone?" "Not so much anymore," he said, thinking of the people who now passed through his life. "Someone needs to be here, to help others like you." Nijoni nodded, accepting this with the pragmatism of a child who had learned early that life offered few choices. "If soldiers come again?" Thomas smiled slightly. "I'll manage." Before dawn, they prepared to depart. Thomas provided fresh supplies, a detailed map with water sources marked, and a letter of introduction to a sympathetic rancher near the Colorado crossing. As Auchini mounted her horse, she fixed Thomas with a penetrating gaze. "Among my people, saving a child creates a bond of kinship. You are family now, Thomas Blackwood, whether you wished it or not." "I wish it," he replied simply. Hayes clasped Thomas's hand. "We'll send word when we reach California. Watch for a letter from John Smith." Thomas nodded, understanding the need for aliases. As they prepared to ride out, Nijoni approached one last time. From her pocket, she withdrew another small object, a carved wooden horse no bigger than a child's thumb. "For protection," she said, pressing it into his palm, like the stone. Thomas closed his fingers around the tiny sculpture. "I'll keep it safe until we meet again." "We will," she said with certainty beyond her years. "The stone tells me." As they rode away, disappearing into the pre-dawn shadows, Thomas stood watching long after they were gone from sight. The empty ranch didn't feel empty anymore. The silence didn't echo with loneliness, but with purpose. Inside, he placed the carved horse beside Rebecca's photograph. Two talismans now, one representing his past, one his future. The lonely rancher who had hidden an Apache girl in his cellar had found something he'd never expected. Not just purpose, but belonging. 3 weeks later, when Hayes returned with another group seeking passage westward, Thomas Blackwood was waiting with the cellar door open and the coffee already brewing. The army might come knocking again someday, but until then, his door remained open to those who needed it most, an unexpected legacy that would outlive the man himself.